let's go on to questions. And at the end, I'm going to ask all of the panelists to give their final observations, having heard each other and having heard the discussion in the meeting. So we'll stop that after about half an hour. So we'll take questions from the floor now. I'll take a few at a time and direct them to panel members. If you want to ask a question of a specific panel member, please say so. So we've got 3 hands raised at the moment. I know, Marie, if you can raise your hand as well, because I know that you wanted to ask a question. Les, I saw some of your comments in the chat, also tied with some comments by Bill. So shall we take your contribution first, please?
Okay, thanks.
Can turn your video on if you...
I would put on the video if I could figure out where.
Okay, well, we can hear you anyway.
Okay, yes. Yeah, thanks to all the speakers. I mean, this event overall rightly advocates that the Israeli settler colonial apartheid regime be replaced with one democratic state with universal equal rights for all. Question is, how can we, in the broad sense, get from here to there? We know much better what is the enemy, that Israel is carrying out a joint US, UK, EU genocide. You know, Israel is the front for that effort. So I want to suggest an analogy with apartheid South Africa, which was defeated by several means. In effect, the anti-apartheid movement, both within and outside that country, turned the regime into a liability for Western imperialism, which then withdrew its support. In order to replace the Israeli regime with one democratic state, is it likewise necessary to turn Israel into a liability? Or even more ambitiously, would it be necessary to defeat Western imperialism itself? Either way, how can the entire Palestine solidarity movement, both there and globally, achieve sufficient force? So I conclude there.
Yeah, thank you, Les. That picks up on some of the observations that I just made. I'm sure the panel will be able to come back on that. Shall we take contribution now from Marie? Hello, Marie. If you're able to
mute, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Oh, you've just gone off again. Can you unmute, please, Marie?
Yeah, unmute.
That's it. We can hear you now.
Okay. Well, it's a great meeting. There's people from all over the world. The great speeches. I think that what we are looking at is this democratic state. There is no doubt that, of course, it's required. It's not going to happen in the circumstances where we are, but we can already put that question together with what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think it's been demonstrated by others before me that there is a trend towards wanting to kill those who are in power. They do not see the target as a military thing they must oppose, but people. They want to attack people. And so I think that it's not true that this is not possible to actually tackle this, because already there's millions of people who intervene in the streets for the Palestinians. So it's not like we're starting from nowhere. And I would like to just make a final point. I have noted that in the US, a company called Two Lanterns Venture Capital provides slices of funding in a non-profit accelerator system for startups in panelists.
Yeah. So we're hoping to see you. Carry on, Marie. You need to unmute again, Marie. Thank you. That's better. Please unmute.
Unmute. Oh, right. Now, I don't mean to pretend to be a very, as knowledgeable as the people who've spoken, but I thought our friends Rania and also the other comrade, I forgot his name now, spoke extremely well about the world process. And I see, now I want to finish this, I see that there are venture companies, venture capital, which is now being invested on a big scale in Israel, because in Israel there has developed in its warmongering, it has developed the ability to see which other more perfected weapon is required. And then Israel has the ability to say that this is a proven weapon which has been proven on the ground. And this is now being moneyed, and investments, making startup companies, big investments is going there by the billions. And I will write this down somewhere else in order to be short. But the result of that is that there's incorporation of Israel's top military and financial sector with the world imperialist complex of military and finance system. So in fact, it's not like yesterday when capitalism was, still improving or being capitalism. Now it is in fact just high finance imperialism, and that sector has no interest in people. It's only interested in for a few, and then could the rest of us please die? And I think that I want to congratulate Haim, who spoke very well, much better than me about this. And I call on comrades to see the need to have street and local organizing people's assemblies of, we go to demonstrations and go home. No, we have to stay mobilized and to have a constant, permanent functioning. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I think Greg's been added to the panel by a comrade. Greg, did you want to make a contribution before we go back to our panelists for responses?
I did, thanks. I'd like, first of all, to comment on something that Les said, and then I'll ask my question, which is different. I actually disagree with the way Les described what happened in South Africa. What actually happened in South Africa is that the upsurge internally turned the regime into something that couldn't survive. And the decision of the imperialists to walk away from it came after it was clear that the regime was going to collapse. And what they were betting on was that apartheid could be ended in a way that would protect capitalism. And that is what happened. But the reason it happened was because that was actually the aim of the ANC. And that's the real story of what happened in South Africa, not that the thing became a liability and then the US turned their back on it. It was about to fall when they turned their back on it. Anyway, that's by the by. My question is that this really does depend on what Palestinians think and what they choose to do. And so the question is, what do we think the current attitude of Palestinians is to the prospect, to the possibility of a one-state solution? That is the most important question, I think. And I think that Gada, and maybe Haim also referred to the possibility that this was going to be very difficult because of what we've just been through over the last year. But nonetheless, I think some focus now has to come on the question of how is this debate going on there? Because we are not in we can articulate the argument from outside as to why a one-state solution is the best solution, but that doesn't get us anywhere unless it's resonating inside Palestinian society. So I'm really asking a question of fact. What is the state of play in that debate internally? Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to just bring the panel onto the screen now so that they can respond to those 3 points. If you can help Matthew, please. And we'll spotlight each of the panel members. Me and Hein. Okay. Oh, where's Rania?
Just there.
Okay, so we've got these points, and let's ask the question again about the route to achieving the state. Marie's point specifically about high finance, which was addressed to, by Hein, but Hein may want to add to that. And then there was a point by Greg, which I think, what's the view of the Palestinians, and what do the Palestinians want? And Hein and Garda and others may have a view on that. So who on the panel would like to begin to respond to one or any of those points raised by our attendees, please?
I'm happy to take the points about how to achieve this and how do Palestinians feel. Well, these are really key points, because in the end, we can suggest a way forward. We can talk about what would be the best solution for this problem, but without being able to point to a way in which it can happen or even begin to happen, I think it loses the value of the point. Yes, indeed, that is really the key question. How can we achieve this? I've often thought about this, and in terms of what do Palestinians want, we don't fully know, because opinion polls have consistently shown in the past a support for the two-state solution, although support for the one-state idea has gained ground. So that is the actual situation. Now, we don't know what's happened to all of that as a result of the genocide. We do know anecdotally that for Palestinians, the idea of actually living together with the criminals who've destroyed your lives is absolutely impossible. It's not so my suggestion has been, when I talk about this, is that when we want to talk about the creation of a democratic state, we have to try and see it as a long-term destination. That is sort of the point where we aim to reach, not immediately, not at all. And I would therefore say that nobody can, at the moment, things are so severe, they're so bad, it's not possible to talk about long-term needs. But I would add that there are things on the way to this. The more people talk about the one democratic state, the more the idea takes on, the more it becomes familiar. So, as you know, with all political ideas, there's two stages. First is the acceptability of the idea. Do people think it's desirable? And only at the second point is, do they think it's feasible? So it's that way around. With one state, in my experience, it's always been messed up. You start talking about the one democratic state idea, people jump up and say, it can never happen, Israel would never let you, etc., etc. But of course, loses the point. You actually have to get the acceptability of the idea to be much more widespread, universal than it already is. That's stage one. And then the pressure of that agreement with the idea leads us onto the stage two, which is how do we make it happen? And that I think is the way around it should be, and that's the way we have to think about it.
Thank you, Garda.
Can I continue?
Hi, next, thank you.
Right. I totally agree with all that Radha said. And I want to say that there are ways of starting the process, and which is what we need to do. I'm part of ODSC. I think Rade is also part. I'm on the executive of ODSC, which is probably the largest group. And it is based in Palestine and has Palestinian leadership like all the other groups. And that is the first problem. The first problem is there are 3 or 4 one-state groups. What we tried, myself and Palestinian colleagues, over the last 3 months, without success yet, but I think we're trying again all the time, is to bring those groups together. Because if we want one state, we also want one large group arguing for it. And that's understandable and agreeable. At the moment, it is stopped by something very important. One of the groups, the one that I'm a member of, is actually close to the idea of binationalism. I totally am against it, and I think most of the groups are against it. We need to resolve that. And I think we are going towards resolution. I hope so. And once in my talk, I was speaking against binationalism, because binationalism is just giving a lease of life to Zionism. And no one should do that. No one at all should actually be confused by the idea of binationalism. Now, there are some signs that this is now understood, or getting better understood even by Israelis. They started 4 different groups for confederation or federation between Israelis and Palestinians. This is evidence that they know that, the clock is ticking and Israel is on the way out. When I and many others are saying that Israel and Zionism are on the way out, we are actually looking not at the world fighting Zionism, which I wish it was, but it wasn't. It isn't yet. But actually what happens inside Israel. Israel is falling apart. Israel is more divided than any other society on earth. The only thing that they are united about is against the Palestinians and for genocide and attacking Iran and attacking Lebanon and attacking anyone that raises their head. But everything else they disagree on. So Israel is actually not tenable anymore as a society. It's definitely not democratic even for Jews, and let alone for Palestinians. So in a sense, Les is not right, I think, when he talks about the viability being an international issue. The viability for the West of Israel is going down all the time, because of all the crazy plans that the West is coming up with, from Ukraine to a war on China and Russia, and nuclear war, and of course, attacking Iran. So in a sense, the West is now also in a process of falling apart. And I just want to say that one of the things that many of us in the different parts of the campaign for one state have realized and are now doing is a project called Bring Gaza Home. And that's, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about what we do about the Gazans, 2 million people now, because around 300,000 were killed. So 2 million people are going to die if Israel is allowed to continue. So this is a project, we've published an article about it in Al Jazeera, please have a look at it, of actually bringing the one state through helping the Palestinians of Gaza, bringing them, forcing Israel through a list of measures which I enumerated, so I will not repeat. And these measures can be done. South Africa was knocked out of the UN for misdemeanors in comparison to genocide. So it's possible to do that. It's possible to create an international force. It is possible to force sanctions on Israel, whether the Israelis like it or not. Who cares if they like it? It doesn't matter if they like it. It's like saying, oh, we can't actually end the war in Ukraine because Zelensky wouldn't agree to it. Zelensky is a puppet. If the Americans want to end the war, they will end the war tomorrow. If the Americans want to end the genocide, they wouldn't arm Israel like they do. So basically bringing the people of Gaza into Israel so the life is saved will kickstart, if you want, the one-state solution by starting the return process, louder. This is very important.
Thank you very much, Chaim. Tony, Rania, do you have quick comments to make, or shall we move on to our next batch of questions?
Yeah, no, I do have a few things.
Okay.
I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of Zionism today, and possibly the beginning of the end of imperialism as we know it as well. Regardless of what the Palestinians want or desire, and I believe most of them now desire a one-state solution, that is the only possible solution that can possibly be achieved. Two states is a complete illusion, and we're wasting our time and diverting our energy if we even go down that road. Binationalism died in 1948. There's no point in resurrecting a dead body. It's simply useless. Of course, there are comparisons with South Africa, but they're limited because South Africa depended on the exploitation of black labor. Israel does not depend on the exploitation of Palestinian labor. Israel is far more genocidal than the South African state was, and that is a key difference. But the other point to mention is the Palestinians by themselves don't have the strength or the power, just demographically, apart from anything else, to overthrow Zionism. It is a region-wide conflict. It is absolutely necessary that the client comprador Arab regimes are overthrown by the Arab peoples. They are complicit with Israel. When you look at those pathetic figures, the king of Jordan, the Saudi king, and all the rest of them, they are partners in crime, junior partners, but partners in crime nonetheless. They have to go as part of the overall struggle. I have no doubt that if Israel is seen to be a liability to imperialism, if it's realized that Western interests are in danger, then Israel would be dropped. There's no morality in US imperialism. It has no affectionate bond with Israel. They may claim it now, of course, but they'll eat their words in the day if it has to be. Their economic and imperial interests predominate. So we should be under no illusions whatsoever as to the task before us. And the task of the solidarity movement, first and foremost, is to delegitimize the Israeli state and to say that we want a democratic state, not a Jewish supremacist state. We have to be very clear, whatever organizations we're in. And any organization that says it's a Palestine solidarity campaign must take a support for a one state as given. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Did you want to come in, please?
Yeah, I wanna just add to what everybody else was saying, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And I know there are difficult days ahead, and we've all been watching very difficult days. And I'm not trying to make it sound like it's some sort of cakewalk, the defeat of Israel and the Zionist project. But I just want to remind people of a few things, because it's not just what we do in the West. There is, as Tony mentioned, there is a regional war taking place right now. The U.S., since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been really focused on constantly reshaping the Middle East to its liking. And it hasn't actually worked, because we are in 2024 and there are the Yemenis, the Iraqis, the Iranians now, the Lebanese and Palestinians all firing at Israel. They're making it really not pleasant to live in Israel. The Israelis are literally, like, just today, Hezbollah fired like 100 missiles at Israel and hit Haifa. Same thing happened yesterday. Hezbollah is firing ballistic missiles at Israel, and some of them are actually landing because, yes, Israel has this 3-layered air defense system, but it doesn't protect it from every missile. And it's going to get worse. The Yemenis are firing ballistic missiles at Israel. The Iraqis are firing, I'm not a military expert, so please, I think it's ballistic missiles, but if it's not, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. But the Iraqis are firing and hitting Israel. Palestinians yesterday on October 7th, after a year of genocide in Gaza, Hamas managed to fire at Tel Aviv? I mean, I woke up to news yesterday that Tel Aviv was being hit. So all that's to say, Israel is suffering. It's going to actually need to suffer more for it to concede anything ever, because the problem is that, as the Israelis like to say about the Arabs, all of their existence, we only understand force. It's one of those every accusation is actually a confession situations. The Israelis actually only understand force. And so that's what you see happening in the region right now. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the resistance axis and Israel are militarily comparable in any way. Obviously, one of them has far superior weapons, far superior technology in every way because of everything at its disposal by the US and the Western countries. But regardless of all that, I just want to point out again that for the last year, since last October 7th, when Hamas paraglided into their former villages, basically, and did a lot of damage, and it was completely chaotic, Israel has been trying to reestablish its military legitimacy since that day. So yes, the society is consumed by hate and obviously an expansionist Nazi-like agenda. But that said, it has to do also with reestablishing their military legitimacy, and they haven't done that yet. They haven't achieved any of their military objectives. It started out with defeat and dismantle Hamas, return the hostages. Neither of those two things have happened. They also added to those objectives to return their settlers to the north. Not only has that not happened, they are actually, as a result of their war on Lebanon, they're expanding the radius of where Israelis aren't going to want to live or be able to live anymore. So they have internally displaced people for the first time ever in their own country, which is something that Hassan Nasrallah, in every single speech he's given since October, repeatedly mentioned. That is doing damage to the Israeli psyche. It's doing damage to Israel's ability to have a functioning economy because of how much industry is based in the north that can't function right now. And also this entire war is doing damage to Israel's economy. And yes, the West right now can continue to fill those holes, but also if you're like a Jew living comfortably in the West, you're not going to want to move to this place. It's a disaster with a bunch of crazy people living in it. So Israel's also losing out, or going to lose out more on that demographic influx it's constantly relying on, because people aren't going to, want to make aliyah if this continues, and they're being fired at by the entire region. So we have to take those things into consideration. Also, as people feel incredibly demoralized and defeated, I know this has been going on for 76 years, but this sort of ramp up in depravity that started a year ago, I mean, liberation takes a lot of sacrifice. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but Algeria, in the course of 10 years, 1.5 million people were killed, but they did liberate themselves from French colonial rule. I mean, I hope it doesn't get to that. I'm just reminding people, how long did South Africa exist before it didn't? A pretty long time. I mean, you go back in history, how long, have a lot of go back to the Soviet Revolution. How long were people across the Soviet Union living under horrific czar and monarchy and feudalism before they liberated themselves? I mean, the liberation means sacrifice. There's going to be a lot of loss in that process, and it's not going to come overnight. How long did it take to defeat Nazi Germany? This has been a year. I hope this doesn't go on for 5 or 6 years, but we have to understand this is a long war, and there's going to be a lot of loss. And for those of us who are sitting in comfortable Western capitals, it is on us to not feel defeated and to not get demoralized, because there are people over there operating in the most difficult circumstances. They are fighting for their lives from underneath tunnels. And one day that's going to be written about as the most valiant and heroic fight against genocide ever. So the least we can do, where we have food to eat and water to drink and lights to turn on, is not get defeated, demoralized, go show up at protests, organize with your local community. I mean, do what you need to do and what you can do in your capacity to help this along. And that's all I can say on that. I don't have all the answers, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, Rania. As Marie said, well said, and your points about Israel is clearly not invincible. Iran has struck back, and very subtly, and shown that it can strike if it wants to. And we've heard a lot of evidence about Israel being well on the way to, if not already, a failed state. Not least that every Israeli is going to have to be or is conscripted. So not a great place to be. We've got 2 people promoted to the panel with further contributions, questions. Mark and Steve, you can make it brief because we do still have 3 other people wanting to ask questions, and I want to allow the panel to feed back their final observations at the end as well. So if you can speak first, Malcolm, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, I will make it very brief. A lot of people have been talking about the idea that Palestine might become a democratic state. I mean, what I find interesting about that is I think in the whole of what might be called the Muslim world, I don't think there is a single democratic state. There was something called the Arab Spring, and a lot of us thought something might happen. And of course, we all know what happened with that. As Tony's pointed out, the Arab states all around have been sitting on their hands. They're all loaded up with Western weapons, no doubt, etc. So first of all, I don't know why anybody thinks that Palestine suddenly, the Palestinians will suddenly turn themselves in from Morocco to more or less Pakistan, can turn themselves into a democratic state. And the other thing is, one person mentioned the idea of de-Zionization of the Zionists to live in Palestine. Well, that's a sort of nice word, but I mean, it seems to me completely impossible, given the level of hatred that must exist. I mean, I'm not from that area, obviously, but I mean, if I was, my level of hatred of, if I was Arab of any sort, my level of hatred would make it impossible for me even to sit in a room from somebody from who was a Zionist, let alone live next door to them and sort of help them take their kids to school, etc., etc. So I don't know how anybody thinks de-Zionization could possibly take place. I mean, what seems to me you need is a sort of reverse Nakba, but that, of course, might seem to be a bit unpopular. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. If panelists consider Malcolm's point while I move on to Steve. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Esther. Thank you for the panel for all their contributions. And I'm going to go back to something which Tony said died in 1948, but here we go. It's going to come again, which is binationalism. I want to bring that up, although not the same as it was in 1948, because I don't think there was an Israeli nation in 1948, and I don't think there was a really Palestinian nation really in 1948. So that's something that's come out of 70 years of struggle, the emergence of 2 distinct nations. So I think we could talk about it now if we couldn't talk about it then. You have to make a distinction between the Zionist state and the Israeli nation. And the Israeli nation's got 80% Hebrews and 20% Arabs. And everybody seems to forget that 20% of Israelis are Arabs. So if we just like South Africa, got rid of the apartheid state, but that liberated the South African nation from apartheid. So similarly, Israel could get rid of, in theory, a Zionist state, and the Israeli nation could be liberated from Zionism. That seems to me at least feasible. Or they couldn't do it without Palestine. So without the Palestinian people, that it seems to me would never work. So I'm in favor of 1 state for 2 nations. I think there are 2 nations contesting that space, and there has to be a democratic way in which they can coexist together. So I think Haim's idea of a constitutional republic, or I would call it a federal secular republic, it must be secular. It cannot be an Islamic or a Jewish religious state. It has to be secular. That is quite revolutionary, a thought in itself in that area anyway. I don't have time to talk about, I think Haim took us on the right track by beginning by talking about putting it in the context of world imperialism, but I'll leave that aside. I think that was the right track to take. I think 2 states died on October the 7th. I mean, this might seem odd. I think it was complete. You could argue it was dead before, but I think what happened on October the 7th finally killed two states. Although, and this is why it's contradictory, more people talked about two states than ever before. I mean, everybody started talking. The more dead it was, the more everybody talked about it. But it was killed by that rebellion. There's not going to be a two-state solution. There wasn't going to be one before. I think, as people have said, it long since died. But that was the end of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. So I would like, we're actually running into the time that I wanted to give to the panelists for their final conclusions. So I wonder if you could, dear panelists, provide your closing comments and perhaps respond to Malcolm on how can we possibly achieve this, how could Palestinians possibly live alongside Zionists, and Steve's point about two nations in one state, which is a slightly different aspect of the discussion to what we've discussed so far. So can I call on you, Tony, first? Bear in mind you've only got 2 or 3 minutes to sum up, and if you want to respond to Steve and or Malcolm. Thank you. You unmute, please.
Okay. I mean, firstly, it has been a wonderful meeting, and we have had, I think, a really good discussion. I don't agree with Steve that two states died on October the 7th. It was never alive in the first place. There was no chance whatsoever that Israel would ever agree to it. I also don't agree, and I know this is the position of some Israeli anti-Zionists like Matt Penn, that the Israeli Jews constitute a nation. No, I don't want to go over the history of the debates as to what constitutes a nation, but what binds Israeli Jews together, first and foremost, is their antagonism to the Palestinians. It's not some indigenous organic history and culture that has grown up. Take away that antagonism, take away the Jewish supremacy, and they will probably fall amongst themselves. There is no unifying factor once you take away Zionism. And so to suggest that you have an Israeli Jewish nation, I think is really a way of resurrecting Zionism by the back door, and I would oppose it. There has to be one Palestinian state. And incidentally, just as the whites in South Africa were white South Africans, I mean, I know some of them wanted a separate white state, but that was never feasible. So the Jews in Israel who remain will be Jewish Palestinians. They may not like it. They will have to lump it, I'm afraid. That is just how things are. That is the price they will pay for their own defeat. As regards Malcolm's point about the level of hatred, I mean, yes, I heard the same thing in Rhodesia and South Africa. The level of hatred is such they'll never come to terms with it. Take away the state structures that perpetuate supremacy, and then they do come to terms with it. It will be difficult, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. But once the American guarantee, once the imperialist interference, once all the rest of it is removed, then the material basis for that hatred also disappears. And being a Marxist, I look at the material base, not the ideological superstructure, first and foremost. And that's why I say it's going to be a long struggle. And it's going to be a bloody struggle, as Rania said. I agree with that. But I do believe, along with Ilan Pappé and others, that we are seeing the beginning of the end of Zionism. The situation today cannot continue indefinitely. We have to see the de-Zionization or maybe the denazification of Israel, because it cannot continue as it is. And in the process, imperialism itself may be fatally wounded. But as I said, we also have to see the end and the overthrow of the Arab regimes, which are also perpetuating the Israeli state. The land corridor between the UAR, Jordan, and Israel, you know, the support they're effectively giving to that genocide. Those regimes must be made to pay the price of what they've done. It's absolute treachery. And I look forward to their overthrow. So Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a great meeting. It's a great pity that Ali Abu Nima could not have come, but he had food poisoning, so I think we can forgive him. Okay.
Yes, we'll pass on our best wishes to Ali. Thank you for that additional comment at the end, Tony, about the surrounding supporting states. May I pass over to you now, please, Garda.
Right, thank you very much. Just really a couple of points. The question of no democracy in the Arab world, therefore, how very unlikely that you could have a democratic state instead of Israel-Palestine. I don't buy that really. It doesn't. It's most unhelpful. You set up, if you're going to set up, you have a project. Your project is defined as a situation in which there are equal rights, equal citizenship, one person, one vote. Clearly, that is a democracy. You don't really need to dress it up any other way. The question of de-Zionization, look, this is essential, but it will not happen by somebody telling Zionists to abandon Zionism. Of course not. And it won't happen by any kind of educational course. The way it will happen is by the force of circumstance. So when you've actually got a context in which Zionism cannot survive, then Zionism will be discarded. Finally, the question of two nations. Now, you know, I hear this a lot, and I cannot stress strongly enough that what we're dealing with in Palestine is a settler colony that has been imposed on an indigenous people. That's what we're dealing with. So one has to adjust one's vision to start with. If your starting point is that there is something called Israel, Israelis, and that it represents something real in the national sense, then there's no way forward from that. One has to start from the truth. And the truth is that what we have in Palestine is a settler colony, called itself Israel and called its people Israelis, and is living inside Palestine against the will of the Palestinian people. That's the real situation.
Yes.
So I don't have any issue about binational. There's no such thing as binationals. Finally, just one word, if you'll allow me. You know, I've heard it on during this webinar as well as with many others now, the announcement of the coming death of Israel. You know, I can understand, I agree intellectually. I can agree with the sentiment. I agree even with the logical conclusion of what's been happening. But my fear is that while Israel is dying, if it is indeed dying, it will cause enormous damage, enormous destruction. That is what my real fear is. So in a sense, while we're commenting on its demise, it will already have attacked so many people, might well be attacking Iran, might well be provoking something very large and very, very frightening. So that is really my fear. And we must not, though comforting, it's very comforting to think of this Zionist project coming to an end. Of course, it's very comforting, but we have to be realistic as well. It's not dead yet. And in its dying throes, if indeed they are, it will cause enormous hardship and damage to the region and to its people.
Yeah, thank you, Garda. So the destruction of the parasite will be in itself extremely destructive. Thank you. Over to you, Chaim, now, please, for summing up, and if you wish to respond to those final comments.
Sure. First of all, thanks to Rada for removing us from the alien field of two nations that live in some kind of space which doesn't exist, and putting it into the reality of a colonial regime and the people under its jackboot, which they have been for more than the 76 years of Israel, because the British Empire before has done the Zionist work for them. So actually, Palestinians have never lived in an environment which was democratic or conducive for democracy. And yet, I have been involved in working and also making films about the different intifadas. And I have never seen a more democratic nation than the Palestinians when they are allowed to express themselves without, you know, at the time, in the first Intifada, about 600 children were killed for throwing stones. This was a murder of little children. And Palestinians did not use arms. They used politics. They used actually mostly women, because the men were in jail, use democratic politics and decision-making of the type that I wish I could see in this benighted country of Britain, which, you know, some people here are saying the Arabs are not democratic. I mean, Britain is a democracy. Britain that created the problem of Palestine is now the example of democracy. The Labour Party is a democracy that supports genocide. I'm not talking about the Tories. So we could be here until the cows come home. There is a kind of Islamophobia inherent in the idea that the Arabs are not democratic, when thousands of Arabs died in 2011 fighting for democracy against the West. So I think we should be very careful about that type of sentiment, which actually is somewhat racist. Now, I think that the most important thing that we need to think about is indeed the end of Israel, because as I said about the United States, the worst time is when empires are going down. And there is no doubt, I'm sure in our fourth mind, that Israel will cause enormous damage on the way down. And what we as the people outside the region can do and must is to actually make this impossible or minimize it. And we can do that by some of the things that I suggested through the UN. And that will, very interestingly, needs a total change of the UN. The UN is a Western undemocratic institution where the US can veto and stop anything. And this has got to go. This is a relic of the past, and it is not logical, it's not legal, it's not justifiable. The UN needs to be an active organization for peace and equality, and it isn't that. And I think Palestine might place it in a place there that they need to change the UN. This is one of the things that is very urgent, because without a change, the United States will lead us all to destruction. So yes, the Israelis are very good at killing people, and they will kill more people. And, you know, the French killed 1.5 million Algerians, and yet they had to leave. Israel will have to disappear, and it is now disappearing in stages. It is indeed a death by 1,000 cuts.
Thank you, Chaim. And last but not least, Rania, would you like to give us your closing responses and comments, please?
Yes, this was fantastic. I'm so lucky to be with such a great panel of people. And Chaim, you took the words out of my mouth. We don't have democracies in the West, so I'm not sure what democracies in the Middle East we should be comparing to. And I mean, I'm not going to go too deep into this because there's no time, but it will be interesting to see that if there is a broader escalation with Iran, you know, China and Russia haven't done anything materially so far. I mean, rhetorically, they've been very supportive of those being attacked by the Israelis, but they are close allies of Iran. And so I am curious to see if they would be willing to stand by, you know, I'm not saying they'll involve themselves militarily, but Iran is, you know, the US taking down Iran would be a huge security risk for both of those countries. So I'd be curious to see what they might do in the case of an actual attack on Iran to like overthrow the government. But I also think we have to balance in you know, the big picture sense, being realistic about the difficulties ahead, yes, to everything everybody said, with also not, again, feeling defeatist and demoralized, because it is a long road ahead. And I want to use the example of Vietnam. You know, the Vietnam War was horrific. It went on for more than a decade. You could even say a couple decades if you want to take it back even further. Vietnam suffered so much, and it had a very strong resistance in North Vietnam. And ultimately, the Americans were defeated. And today, Vietnam is an incredibly successful and powerful country. And I mean, that's different, but I just think it's important to remember that, because people were up against so much trying to end that horrific war. And I'm going to end by plagiarizing a very good friend and comrade of mine, Vijay Prashad, who always tells this story about Ho Chi Minh. That a group of Europeans, I want to say it was Italians, but I might be getting that wrong, so I'm just going to broadly say Europeans, who were quite revolutionary, had gone to visit Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and they asked him, what can we do to help? Like, what can those of us in Europe do to help? And he said, go home and do revolution where you live. And, you know, we know what he meant by that, right? Like, go to your imperial core and do revolution in your countries, because your countries are the problem. And so those of us who are in the imperial core, again, we have a certain kind of power here collectively to organize, not just against what our governments are doing, but against this disgusting, parasitic, capitalist, imperialist system, because that is at the root of all of this. It's at the root of the problem when it comes to Palestine. It's at the root, the whole region, all these Arab regimes that are in collaboration with Israel and the US. It's, you know, I'm going to go back to it's, you know, socialism or barbarism. And so those of us in the hyper capitalist imperial core countries, we have to be pushing for socialism in our own countries in the ways that we can. And so I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rania. Well, we've heard tonight a lot of information and views about the way forward, including tangible solutions, albeit ones that will result in much pain and violence in the meantime. We've also had a lot of comments in the chat, which we will review. And if there's anything particularly that we think should be shared, then we can send that out afterwards. We will be preparing videos of each speaker and also of contributions at the end that we'll be putting up on YouTube. There are some Q&A in the Zoom which we haven't yet answered, so we'll do our best endeavours to get those answered before we mail attendees after the meeting. Thank you so much to our panellists for attending, our very knowledgeable and experienced panellists for attending and enthusing us this evening. Thank you to all of our audience, most of whom stayed the course, and we look forward to future meetings with you. Thank you very much, all, and have a good weekend.